Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I am Cody Eaton with JBS International. Thank you for joining today's webinar, See My Color, Why Racial Colorblindness Is Unethical with Crystal Bennett. Before we begin, we'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. All participants in the webinar will be muted for the duration of the presentation. However, we still want to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them using the chat feature. You can open your chat window by clicking on the chat icon located at the bottom center of your toolbar window. We will continuously monitor the chat throughout today's webinar, but the presenters will address comments and questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and presentation slides will be made available to the OVC-TTA mailing list in the coming weeks. There will be a link to a post-event survey sent in the chat at the end of the presentation, as well as emailed to all registered participants in the coming days. We would greatly appreciate it if you filled it out, as this will support future development efforts. If you experience any technical issues during the session, please message us using the chat feature or email us at ovc-tta@jbsinternational.com. Today's webinar provides 1.5 hours of National Board of Certified Counselors credit. If you're interested in earning these credits, please email your name and email address to ovc-tta@jbsinternational.com and make sure to fill out the post-event survey that will be sent at the end of the webinar. Once you have done this, a certificate will be emailed to you within the coming weeks. Now, I'd like to turn things over to our presenter.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Really great to be in space with you all. I am joining y'all from Southern California, and my name is Crystal Bennett. I'm the CEO and founder of an organization called Thrive and do quite a bit of work around creating individually focused, trauma-informed, and closely responsive strategies in order to do our best work with individuals and communities. So you all are in space with me today to talk about See My Color, Why Racial Colorblindness Is Unethical. I invite you all to chat with each other and to chat with me in the chat box. I love to have workshops interactive, so please chat and feel free to ask your questions in the chat rather than saving them for later, because I can't assure us that we will have time later, depending on the extent of the conversation that we engage in today, or throughout our time together today, I should say. So I ask that as we enter this space, is that we enter with two shared agreements, if you will. Any conversations having to do with discussions around race, around diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, have the potential to create very strong emotions. In all honesty, I would not be doing my job if my presentation did not encourage you to stretch yourself, potentially experience some discomfort, and really reevaluate some of the things that you've learned throughout your lifetime, and the way that you engage in work with individuals and communities. So those two shared agreements for our time together today is that I encourage you all to not feel like you have to have the right answer. I'm not even sure I like the term right? There is not, because what we assume is that if you're not right, you must be wrong. And that's that binary way of thinking. So let's lean into understanding that the only ability that we have to grow is if we lean into that discomfort and stretch ourselves into a place where we say the things that we're able to say to really explore where one another is coming from and give one another a little bit of grace as we lean into understanding the perspectives of others. The other thing that I would ask us to do as we enter into our conversation today is to kind of push the notion of being good people to the side of our heads. And so some of you in this moment might be feeling a little discomfort already and thinking to yourselves, so Crystal, you don't know me. How dare you come into this space and tell you that I'm a bad person? And that's not what I've said at all. But again, that's that binary way of thinking, is that sometimes we believe that if someone tells us that something isn't good or that we're not good, then we must be bad. What I'm saying is that even good people with the best intentions can create harm. And that's really where I want our starting point to be as we enter into conversation today, is acknowledging that even with the best of your intentions, you may indeed be engaging in actions, behaviors, or having thoughts that have the potential to cause harm with the individuals and communities that you're working with. So if there are additional shared agreements that you would like to bring into the space, certainly feel free to drop those into the chat box. And I'm going to go through and kind of start to move us through our conversation today. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to share a number of statements that I have heard not only in my personal life, but also in my professional life. I have spent the last 25 years of my career working with individuals, working with communities, particularly communities who have experienced harm. And I've heard a number of statements that have made throughout my time, particularly when we think about race and whether or not we see race and the need to acknowledge race. So as I'm saying each of these aloud and as you're reading them on the screen, I would love for you to just put your initial thoughts or feelings in the chat box as I go through each of these one to one. So the first one, skin color is the same as eye color. It's not that significant. So just give some thought as to what does that mean to you? What are some of the thoughts that start to be generated in your minds, or perhaps maybe some of the feelings that you start to feel in your body? We should focus on what makes us similar. We're all one race, the human race. Talking about race only divides us. I don't see color. And all lives matter. So I invite you to share some of your initial thoughts, reactions, feelings in the chat box. Thank you. I see someone who's put in differences should be celebrated. What else comes to your mind as you think about perhaps maybe times you've heard these statements in your life, or initially as you're taking a moment to consider your thoughts on this? And so as you're taking a moment, and I hope that you all were engaged with me today, there are almost 40 of you on here, is that a lot of times these statements are made because people may be trying to communicate the intention around their desire to have a commitment towards equality or have a commitment to fairness. But what's really important for us to acknowledge is that it's not about the intentions of the statements we make, but it's about the impact of such statements. And I see in the chat box, thank you so many of you for starting to chime in here, is that unfortunately these things are heard at least monthly, someone says, right? And I'm curious as you, and one of the things I wanted to put out here as you're responding is go to that blue box as you're responding and click the send to everyone so that we can all see the richness of the comments that are coming through. Right now, several of you have it where it's only coming to me, and I want everybody in the space to see it. As someone says, I know these statements are hard for my friends of color to hear. And so I ask for you to think about like why? Why do you think these statements are hard for individuals of color to hear? Lack of nuance, someone says, lack of complexity or understanding. We need to understand that diversity enriches the human experience. Different skin colors, like different eye colors, are beautiful and significant. Someone says these statements are to avoid and protect privilege, conscious or not. And thank you for making that distinguishment. Yeah, there have never been, to my knowledge, separate water fountains for brown-eyed people. Yeah, what a heavy statement that is to make, right? And so accurate. These statements take away from the experience and struggles as an African-American person. As an African-American person, as someone who may be Latina, as all individuals who may have Black and brown skin, and they may be a way to discount or diminish the realities and the role that color plays in our society, history, present. Yes, I'm loving the richness of the conversations that are coming through. And some of us have been taught to be invisible, or to see people as invisible, or treat people as invisible, or to utilize some of the instances in where we hold privilege that it's easy to turn an eye to not see the things that may make a difference in the lives of someone else. Yeah, and someone mentions the Jane Elliott experiment, as we think about the blue-eyed and brown-eyed children, and how that experiment essentially led to bias and differences in treatment from one group of children to another group of children. So my hope is that as you are seeing and reading the comments that are on the screen, as well as the comments that you all are making as colleagues, is that we need to take a moment to acknowledge the necessity of stopping these types of statements in their track. Because again, going back to intention versus impact, the intention is extremely harmful, and it negates the experiences that many individuals of color have. Now, I sit before you as someone who identifies as a Black cis woman, and it's important for me to come to you and share with you what my identities are, because even though I'm a Black cis woman does not mean that I come before you and speak on behalf of every Black cis woman or every Black individual that's out there, because we're not all monolithic. And we have so many different dimensions to our identities. Is what's important around this conversation today is to get some background information and some insight, and then extending the opportunity that when we're working with people is that we create space to hear their stories and their experiences. So when I hear folks say that they don't see my color, first and foremost, what it is that I think to myself is, how can you not see my color? Look at me, right? For many of you right now in this moment, I am front and center on your computer or on your phone screen. And if I were to ask you to describe me, there would be some of you who would talk about the color of my hair, or the color of my eyes, or the length of my hair, or the color of the shirt that I have on. But for some of you, you would leave out the fact that I'm a brown-skinned woman, right? Or the fact that I have brown skin. And what I'm here to say is that I want you to see my color. I want you to acknowledge that I'm a brown-skinned woman. You may not know my ethnicity, right? But I want you to see that I am a beautiful brown-skinned woman, and don't judge me based on the brownness of my skin. But oftentimes when we beat all around the bush and we fail to acknowledge the color of someone's skin, is that it sends a message of awkwardness. Right? That there is this feeling that something about me and something about the color of my skin makes you feel uncomfortable, makes you feel awkward around me, and it creates a heaviness in the space. And the reality is that you don't see my color, and you don't see me. Approaching situations with a colorblind approach negates the cultural values, norms, expectations, and life experiences for people of color. And how is it that you can have a relationship with me if you don't acknowledge and ultimately accept all that it is that makes me who I am? What you're really saying when you say, I don't see your color, is that I don't see you, I don't know you, and I'm not ready and willing to hear and believe your story, your history, your experiences. And if you're not ready to hear that, then you're being blind to the consequences that many individuals of color experience, especially here in the United States. And if you fail to recognize those consequences, then how is it that you can validate my feelings, my thoughts, my experiences? How is it that you establish yourself as a safe person? Right? For many of us who are engaged in a helping profession, we just believe that we're safe people. And we expect that those that we're working with to simply see us as safe people. But unfortunately, historically, even up to present day, particularly when I think about the social work field, and I am a licensed master social worker, is that our profession has not been safe for many communities and has definitely not been a safe profession for individuals of color to interact with. So that in and of itself means that we have to work a little harder as service providers to be seen as folks who are safe and to create environments that are safe, and that it isn't a one size fits all, nor is it a one size fits most, but safety is ultimately defined by those in which we're working with. And lastly, when I think about the statements, I don't see color or all lives matter, what that tells me is that there's a little bit of white fragility happening, right? And white fragility tends to be that on behalf of an individual who's white, is that there's a need to put up some walls, and there's a need to become defensive when confronted with information about racial inequity and injustice, because that is one's own self-preservation and protection against feelings of guilt or feelings of shame, right? And that takes all of us being willing to do our own work around what identities we hold some power and privilege, and what identities we might have that we experience some oppression. But the truth is that oftentimes when people say, I don't see your color, it really isn't that you don't see my color, but it might be perhaps that you don't see your own. So I'm curious, and again, feel free to engage in the chat box, just any initial responses or questions or feelings that are arising for folks around this need to really acknowledge color and establish ourselves as safe folks by being willing to understand the consequences that people are experiencing as they're navigating space as a person with Black or brown skin. And as you're thinking about that, one question that I would have for you to also think about is, what do you think about our kids? Do you think our kids see color? Do children see color? Thank you for your comment, Katie. What do you think? I pulled this image off of someone's social media. The beauty of children is that they don't see color. You can acknowledge color in an accepting way, right? It doesn't have to be that because I see your color, that color comes with judgment. Right? Perhaps it's about curiosity. It's about being willing to step outside of our own shoes and our own ethnocentric, monolithic ways, our monoculturalist ways, to understand that it's not about right or wrong, but that many of us, based on our culture, just have very different ways of doing things. Your 8-year-old absolutely notices that you have a darker skinned next door neighbor. Someone says, yes, we live in a very diverse area. Kids are with their friends. They see color. Ooh, I love that. They see vibes in color more vibrantly than us older heads. Yes. So I'm going to show you just a brief video that I think perhaps might be a little shocking to some of you. Because I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat box that kind of say, yeah, they see color, which is great, right? That you're actually acknowledging that our kids do see color. But I'm also seeing a bit of, yes, but they don't judge based on it, or they don't use that to define. And so the video I'm going to show you, just to kind of give you a little bit of a preface, is a version of the baby doll study. The original baby doll study was done by Kenneth and Mamie Clark prior to Board versus Brown. And essentially the baby doll study produced a significant amount of research about bias that exists in children that was then used to push for integration. That study has since been repeated over and over, not just here in the United States, but also worldwide. And the results continue to produce the same outcomes. So without giving you any additional information, I'm going to go ahead and shift us into this brief video. And feel free that as you're watching the video to type out what initial thoughts come to mind, what feelings start to be jarred up for you. I will tell you that it's an impactful video. So let me just leave it at that. And if you feel like you need to step away, certainly feel free to take care of yourself as well. I'm just going to turn off my video so that I'm not distracting you over here with my face, and that you can focus explicitly on the content of the video.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
This one. I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
He's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll."
Yeah, that one.
Which one?
This one.
Why do you want that skin color?
Because I don't know. I don't know.
Not sure. What do you think of that skin color?
Well, it looks kind of whitish, and that's all I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? Why do you want that skin color?
Because it looks lighter than this kind, because this looks a lot like that one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I just don't like the way brown looks, because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason. That's all.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they asked what color adults don't like. Do you remember what you said? Which one? That's right, that's what you said. Why do you think adults don't like that color?
Dark.
Dark. And adults, you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
And then which was the The ugly child.
So show me the smart child. Okay, why is she the smart child?
Because she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the mean child. Okay, why is she the mean child?
Because she's way darker.
Okay. Show me the good child. Why is she the good child?
Because I think she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the bad child. Why is she the bad child?
Because she's a lot darker.
Show me the ugly child. Why is she the ugly child?
Because she's like, a lot darker.
So I'm going to invite you to just take a moment to take a couple deep breaths. And just acknowledge that that isn't an easy video. I saw a couple of chats in the chat box and want to invite you to just think about what is standing out to you from this video. And as you think about young people and families that perhaps your work, that you work with, you know, what does this mean to you as you think about the bias that you just saw with these children? Take a moment and put your thoughts in the chat box. So young people are influenced by adults around them. Also, the videos reminding someone that messages don't have to be over or direct. Yes, and I appreciate you bringing up microaggressions because we're actually going to be shifting into that conversation here shortly. Despite parental efforts and intention, the messaging still gets the children, makes you wonder about the influence of religion, the conversations about light and dark. Absolutely. And a lot of times when folks watch this video, it's easy to kind of point fingers at parents. And I would also say that while some of this certainly comes from parents, we do need to look beyond and think about the larger messaging that's happening, thinking about media, thinking about our young people's experience in an academic setting or in a preschool setting, and thinking about how do all of the intersections of many of the systems that our families and that our kids are exposed to send the message that Black is bad and that white is right, right? Because there are a lot of messages when we think about books, when we think about cartoons, when we're thinking about movies, who's the villain? Who is considered the princess or the good person? When we see our kids in school, who's getting suspended? Whose behavior is seen as good, bad, right, wrong? Who's considered ugly? What's considered the standard of beauty? So I love the question around like, how do we change this? And it really brings me to Marcus Garvey's quote, is that a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Let's think about how many young people, I mean, even older people, that we don't know our history. We don't know our traditions, our background. We don't have something to take pride in. And then we see and receive all of these messages from the world around us that defines beauty and that defines bad behavior, or that defines who's at risk and who's considered vulnerable and who's considered successful. And if we don't take the time to educate and to have representation. So when we think about like our office spaces, when we think about information that we're communicating, does it represent the cultures and the community and the traditions of where folks come from? And our young people and our families are continuing to receive negative messages. And someone mentioned earlier around microaggressions. Microaggressions are showing up all day, every day for individuals, not just individuals of color, but for many people who are from marginalized and minoritized communities. And they show up in 3 different forms that can really cut across 9 different themes. I won't go into the 9 themes today, but when we think about the forms of microaggressions, we have a micro assault, which is an overt form of discrimination. It is deliberative, it is intended to offend, and a lot of the times when individuals perpetrate a micro assault is that the response is to gaslight the individual who is now on the receiving end. So an example that I will just share with you all in this space today is I'm a mom of 4 children. I am a spouse of someone who serves in the United States Navy. And we had lived in California several years ago and had received orders to move to Kansas. We bought a home sight unseen in Kansas, fell in love with the home, fell in love with the pictures and the neighborhood that was shared with us, but we hadn't had a chance to visit because of just the fastness that the military was moving us. We moved into our home, and within 6 months, we essentially were forced out of our home and needed to move to a location that was just going to be a safer environment for myself and my family. Our kids were never invited to any other kids' homes. They were never invited to birthday parties or events that happened in the communities. When kids would try to come down to our yard and play with our kids, their parents would come down and march them back up and say, you know, you need to get back over by our house and not be at these people's homes. There was a neighborhood Facebook group where a lot of times, families would put things that were happening in the community in the Facebook group. And on several instances, there were often comments in the Facebook group about the quote unquote colored people in the neighborhood and how people should lock their doors. So on one particular instance, I had addressed the comments that I saw, and I said, you know, if you feel a sense of being unsafe, that is certainly your prerogative, that's your business. However, can we be mindful of language? And, you know, we don't, I'm not colored. We haven't used the term colored since the Jim Crow era. And essentially the response was gaslighting as people started commenting and saying, nothing ever makes you people happy. And why don't you just go back to where you came from? And so this is an example of a micro assault, is that it's overt, it's in your face, it's deliberative, it's intended to offend. Then we have micro insults, and micro insults are typically unconscious or unintentional. But again, we go back to the, it doesn't matter what the intentions are, it's about the impact. And so a micro assault or insult, are statements or behaviors that communicate discriminatory messages. So these statements or behaviors might be someone grabbing their purse as a group of teenagers is walking by, or if there's a group of Black and brown folks that are going on an elevator, that the white people step off because they don't want to be in an elevator with Black and brown folks. Or it's a comment that I often receive in the work that I do in doing public speaking events, is I'm often told how articulate I am. And I'm going to tell y'all that is not a compliment. It is a backhanded compliment, because most of my white counterparts that do this work don't get told how articulate or intelligent they are. And why it's a micro insult or a form of a microaggression is because the only reason it's being said is that there is an assumption around the the intellect of Black and brown folks, and that we are perceived to be intellectually inferior And therefore, when we demonstrate intellect, it seems to be a surprise that then warrants this backhanded compliment. Then another form of microaggressions are microinvalidations. And these are statements which deny, negate, and undermine the realities for individuals of color, for individuals who may be 2S LGBTQIA+, for individuals who may be immigrants, who may have mental health diagnosis, who may be experiencing poverty. You know, the thing about microaggressions is that they tend to be subtle, and they're perpetrated against folks from any marginalized and minoritized communities. So with micro-invalidations, as these are things such as telling someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or the experience of racial color blindness and saying, I don't see color. As you think about microaggressions in the work that you do, whether it's that people who you're working with are experiencing microaggressions outside of, of your service provision, or as you think about the experience people have when they are interacting with service providers, what types of microaggressions do you think often show up in the work? What do y'all think? I'm going to give you a few examples that might help to get you started. So sometimes we tend to compare our own forms of trauma, especially our own identity-based trauma, with the identity-based trauma that someone else may have. So to be able to say, hey, like, I understand what you're going through as a person of color, because as a woman, I face this discrimination also. That's extremely invalidating, because people's trauma should not, there's no comparison with various traumas that people experience. And while you may experience trauma and know what it's like to experience trauma as a woman, you don't know what it's like to experience the trauma as a woman of color. I'm seeing some things come through. So that's not something I've ever witnessed or experienced, right? So your experience must not be true, right? Oh, I've never seen that. I've never experienced that. Okay, well, I have. So does that mean that I'm invalid in what my experience is? Someone says, ask, what proof do you have that you were discriminated against, right? Like asking for proof. What's the evidence? And we even need to think about that when we think about data, is a lot of the time data becomes weaponized against many communities that we're working with, because maybe there isn't statistical significance. And it doesn't matter, because we've got to move beyond the numbers and the quantitative to actually look at the personal experience and provide space for the story and the qualitative. Continuously mispronouncing names with no effort to get it right? Like, we're going to mispronounce names. It happens. And we need to be very diligent about trying to get it right and continuing to pronounce it until we get it right. We don't get to say, hey, like, can I call you such and such for short? Or that I just continue to talk to you without ever saying your name and just kind of pretending like you don't have a name. Yeah, I see another one here about pronouns. I'm not using pronouns because I don't understand them. I'm not sure what there is to understand, right? My pronouns are she, her, they, them, he, him, and it's just like a name. We acknowledge what it is that what someone's pronouns are. Yeah, it's important for understand experiences are unique to individuals, assuming people celebrate specific holidays. Absolutely. Not taking into consideration someone's race when we're thinking about maybe their anxiety, their depression, their post-traumatic stress. saying I don't see color, misgendering. So when we ask someone or say, what are your preferred pronouns? That is extremely offensive. It is simply, what are your pronouns? Continuing to use someone's dead name is, again, it's very similar to misgendering. We are now misnaming. Yeah, someone else says, insisting on the concept of a gender binary. And totally, these do not even need to be race related as we're thinking about microaggressions, because microaggressions span the gamut of many marginalized and minoritized communities. So insisting on gender binary, gender norms, the reinforcing of gender norms, looking at our forms and looking at our policies and looking at anything that's client facing or even internal facing for our team members. Do we consistently use he/she and reinforce the gender binary, or have we moved to they, them, and we recognize that gender is not a binary? Thinking about kids and the days that they have off versus the days that they don't, or even again, your organizations, when you think about which holidays you actually have off, many times they're the federal holidays that are really have that underlying Western connotation. And are there floating holidays that people have to use, or is there the expectation that perhaps if I don't celebrate Christmas, but I celebrate Kwanzaa, that I've now got to dip into my PTO to celebrate a holiday that isn't considered more mainstream, if you will. Tokenizing. So I've got a workshop coming up, I think, that's going to focus on equity frameworks, and we're going to talk a lot about tokenization. Saying we have to use a name because it's a legal name. We'll actually talk about that when we start talking about forms. Yes, there are going to be times where perhaps I need to know what the name is that your insurance might be under, or that other records may be under, but that doesn't mean that I need to consistently call you by that name. It's being able to say to someone, hey, is there any other name that perhaps your insurance is under, or that your records may be listed under, and being able to explain why I need that name to access that information. And again, being very mindful that we're not continuing to use that name in the way that we're referring to someone or having that conversation. Asking only certain questions because of your race, your lived experience. Yes. I love. So again, so many comments. Seeking diversity as a performance rather than creating safe space for diverse members. We're going to talk about that in the workshop that I have coming up, that I talk a lot about diversity really being a distraction. We tend to focus on diversifying, and we just focus on how many Black and brown people can we see, but we're not actually focusing on our policies, our practices, and creating those spaces that ultimately will draw diverse people in, versus just wanting to give the facade of, or really coming across as performative. So y'all keep these comments coming. I love the interaction. Making assumptions about people. So things like, hey, I know Black people are very religious. Well, for some Black folks, there is a strong belief in religion or spirituality, but we can't make assumptions and stereotypes. A lot of times we make assumptions around who can pay and who can't pay, and to say things like, hey, I usually don't do this, but I can waive your fees if you can't afford. I've actually personally in my life have experienced a withholding of service options because of an assumption that I can't pay. And so we think that perhaps we're protecting someone by withholding options, but people deserve to have all of the options available to them, and to have everything laid out so that they can make the most informed decisions for themselves. When we just assume that people's symptomology around, perhaps anxiety or depression is because they're a certain gender or a certain sexual orientation, again, this bootstrap theory, if you just work hard like everybody else, you have a chance to succeed. We tend to label Black clients as loud, emotional, confrontational. say things such as they're oppositional defiant or have conduct disorder or diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, when someone who may be white or of another race has the same behavior, we tend to say, oh, they're assertive, or they're really determined, or we diagnose with a mood disorder. Questioning where someone's problem comes from, using words such as normal and regular, assuming that because someone's experience differs from ours, that perhaps we should just refer them to, for example, I tend to get a lot of people will say, well, maybe, this Black client wants to work with you, Crystal. And it's like, well, just because I'm Black and they're Black doesn't mean that, again, going back to that monolithic, doesn't mean that our experiences are the same. And so we should not just assume and be referring out. And then there's a lot of ableism, right? So communicating that when we think about like disability, is we have to think about like what is our belief when it comes to disability? And do we think that people who have disability are diseased, broken, or need fixing, which is very much a medical model, versus a social model is that folks who experience disability usually experience barriers because of systems of oppression and systems of harm. So really reframing the way that we think about people and circumstances and consider the impact of people in the environment versus just people as a whole. So it looks like y'all have definitely come up with a lot of ideas. And I see someone saying I need to find the source, but there's an article around white children displaying certain symptoms are more often diagnosed with autism, and Black children displaying the same symptoms are more often diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. There's a lot of bias when we think about diagnosis, and that being one. We also tend to find that Black children are overrepresented in special education settings, or more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities when it's not really an inability to learn, but it's a question around learning styles and are we applying multiple intelligences approach to the way that people learn. We also find that Black men are disproportionately diagnosed with schizophrenia when their white counterparts who are displaying very similar behaviors are typically diagnosed with a mood disorder. So there are a lot of examples of this. And so I say that to say, like, when you all are thinking about the work that you're doing, and sometimes you might receive like a referral, and that referral may have all of these diagnoses listed and all of these behaviors that are listed. And you really need to take a step back and ask yourself, how might bias have gone into the description of the person that you are receiving in this paper? How might bias have played into what that diagnosis is that's coming over to you, or as you're completing a referral or filling out documentation? How might you need to check your own bias to ensure that that bias is not coming out and that you're putting a label on a person or on a child that now is going to follow them through service provider to service provider, because perhaps we did not take into consideration culture in situations and circumstances before merely looking at behavior and having some bias around that. So if anything else comes up, please feel free to put those things in the chat box. But microaggressions come up in our work all the time. And when we think about the experience of microaggressions, there was actually a study done for children around their experience of microaggressions. And that study found that on average, particularly for children of color, is that they experience 297 microaggressions within a 3-month period, right? And so when we're thinking about trust and when we're thinking about interaction with children and families, microaggressions are like a slap across the face over and over and over again, or a mosquito bite over and over and over again, right? We just had the 4th of July pass. And for some of you, you may have been sitting outside at a cookout or sitting watching fireworks. And here you are getting bit by a mosquito, and then another mosquito bites you, and another mosquito bites you. And what starts to happen as you continue to get bit by those mosquitoes, or maybe you're in a place where you got red ants crawling on your toes, and you start to get a little hypervigilant, right? You start to actually think a mosquito is around you that isn't even around you, but you find yourself swatting and keep moving, and you feel like something's crawling on you and it's not. That's a very similar experience to microaggressions, is that when people experience microaggressions as a constant, we become hypervigilant. And I put a we in there because I can say I experience microaggressions as a constant. And so then when I walk into spaces or I'm interacting with new people, is that I find myself being extremely hypervigilant and hyper aware, and with an increased awareness of my surroundings and an increased, my defense mechanisms are up. And so we need to be able to see the impact that microaggressions are having, and then break down those barriers to be able to engage with people in a way that isn't going to do further harm. So I want to just further kind of share a little bit more about the impact of microaggressions, especially when they start to go into macroaggressions and aggressions as a whole, or even racism. So I'm going to put 6 true or false questions up on the screen. And I want you to take a moment and just read through each of these and identify whether you think each statement is true or false. So just take about a minute or two and just, you can jot your answers down on a piece of paper or just hold them in your head, but just familiarize yourself with each of these statements. And I see your comment in the chat box too, like being someone who's maybe biracial, or as you indicated, mixed race. Yeah, it can feel like, you're too much of this for this race, or you're not enough of this for this race, and this constant like trying to find where one belongs. I often tell people, I'm biracial. I identify as a Black woman, but my mother's white and my father is Black. And I often tell people that my life has consisted of me always being too Black and never being Black enough, and always experiencing those microaggressions as I try to navigate these two spaces that neither really feels like a place of belonging. All right, so let's start with the first one, and you all can use the chat box. Do you think the first one is true or false? Black men are twice as likely to be incarcerated as white men. What do y'all think? So just put a T or an F in the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing a whole lot of T's. So this is a trick question, y'all. I'm sorry to trick y'all, but the answer is false. Black men are not twice as likely to be incarcerated as white men. They're actually 5 times as likely to be incarcerated as a white man. Even when compared side by side, a Black man and a white man who commit the same crime, the Black man is more likely to receive a 20% longer sentence for same crime committed. So a huge disparity as we think about the incarceration rates of Black men and white men. So let's shift to the middle one. True or false, Black girls are 3 times more likely to be disciplined than their white female classmates. What do y'all think here? E or F? Now y'all are a little bit more hesitant to put my T or my F's in the box. So this one also is a trick question. So Black girls, as we think about Black girls across the United States, state to state, and I certainly am more than willing to share out sources with y'all if you want to email me when we're done, is that anywhere, depending on where you are in the United States, Black girls are anywhere from 5 times as likely to be disciplined, all the way up to 10 times as likely to be disciplined, depending on which state it is that you are. But there are no states where it is twice, triple, or quadruple the amount. It is 5 times all the way up to 10 times. This next one is true, right? Just to not have you feel like, oh, she's just going to keep tricking us. So Black women are indeed accounting for 30% of evictions across the United States, even though Black women only account for about 12% of the entire population in the United States. They make up 30% of our evictions. So we tend to say Black men are being locked up while Black women are being locked out. And I'm hoping that as you're kind of hearing these statistics and thinking about like the experience of crime, thinking about the experience of families being ripped apart and broken apart, thinking about the needs of kids, that you're really starting to think about how are these numbers impacting our kids, our families, and our communities of color, right? And how are you all seeing this reflected in the work that you do? True or false? So give me a T or an F, bottom left hand. 30% of all prostitution arrests are for youth under the age of 18 who are Black youth. What do y'all think here? Yeah, I'm seeing some Fs here. I'm seeing a mix. So this one is false. The number is actually 50%. So what we know is that for prostitution arrests is approximately Black youth under the age of 18 make up about 51% of those arrests. Right, I'm just pausing so that you can sit with that. For Black youth under the age of 18 account for 51% of prostitution arrests. Under the age of 18 years old, right? These are rape victims. Yes, thank you. Why is anyone arresting children for prostitution? Because we know that Black children are often not seen as victims. They're often seen as complicit in the trauma that they experience, right? And so if our Black children are not being seen as children, are not being treated as children, are not receiving services for their victimization, then what we're doing is that we're putting them in juvenile detention. We're putting them in the criminal legal system, and we're setting them up to put them on a pathway of continued criminalization and the need to survive in a system that really has not been built for them. The middle one is true. Black children are 7 times as likely to have a parent who is incarcerated. And then the last one is also true. Black children are 3 times as likely as their white peers to lose their mother by the age of 10. I hate that we can't talk in this space together, but I do invite you to share your thoughts in the chat box. You know, what's resonating with you? What's really evoking some strong emotions? I do see this comment about the adultification of young people of color. There actually are 2 studies out that were done by Georgetown University's Center on Poverty, specifically around the adultification of our Black males and the adultification of our Black females. And within those studies, what those studies found is that for Black males, is people see them as more threatening, as needing less protection, and as less innocent, starting at the age of 10 years old. And for our Black girls, that age drops significantly and drops to the age of 5. That those who were interviewed for the study said that they viewed Black girls as needing less protection, as being more adultified, and needing less support as early as 5 years old. When we think about adultification and the inherent sexualization, I do quite a bit of work in the anti-trafficking field, specifically around race and gender and how that impacts trafficking experience. What else comes up for y'all as you just kind of sit with this information and think about how this impacts the young people and the families that you all are serving in your work each and every day? Katie, others can't see your comment, so I'll read it out. If you can switch your box to go to everyone, because I want to make sure people are seeing your comments. But yeah, they're almost set up for failure. And I would take the almost out of there, Katie. Like, and that's probably my own bias, but they are set up for failure. Right? When we're thinking about, just to add some layers in here, when we think about the school to prison pipeline and start thinking about the numbers there, Black youth are 1.5 times more likely to be below proficient in reading by the 4th grade. Children of color are 7 times more likely to attend an underfunded school. We also know that there's the preschool to prison pipeline. So Black males make up about 18% of preschool population, but represent 41% of preschoolers who receive out-of-school suspensions. Our Black girls make up 19% of enrollments in preschool, and they account for 53% of suspensions in preschool. Right? I see someone else commenting, it's a cycle, right? So we have Black men that are more likely to be incarcerated, Black women more likely to be evicted, which means then we have children who are entering into the child welfare system. And when we look at child welfare, so I've done about 20 years working in child welfare, is that for young people of color or young people who are Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+, is that we're overrepresented in child welfare. We're more likely to run from child welfare and end up experiencing homelessness or houselessness, more likely to end up in juvenile detention. Children of color and individuals who are 2S LGBTQIA+ move from house to house to house much more often when they're in child welfare, less likely to be adopted, spend more time in child welfare, and are more likely to essentially age out without any type of permanent support available. So when we think about the impact that all of this ultimately has when we're thinking about the experiences of racism and sexism and classism and ableism, is that what tends to happen is then we're working with people who've internalized this. We're working with folks that are kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy, which is called stereotype threat, is that because of all of the stereotypes that are out there about who they are and the communities that they come from, is that they fall into embodying those stereotypes and exhibiting the very same behavior that is ultimately expected of them because of the stereotypes placed upon them. And then we also see a significant magnification of mental health symptoms. So when we're thinking about internalized oppression, that is that you may be working with folks who really feel this sense of less than, being grounded in victimhood, feeling overwhelmed, feeling drained, consistently trying to read the people around them, especially people who are a part of the dominant group, believing that oneself has little to no value. We see a lot of colorism in communities of color. And again, that is because of the stereotypes that exist external to those communities, is that lighter skinned, fairer skinned individuals are seen as less threatening, as more beautiful, and are more welcomed and accepted versus someone who has darker skin. A devaluing of people within my own community. So a lot of times communities who've experienced colonization and enslavement start to embrace the mindset of one's colonizers as a way to survive colonization and enslavement, which then means that for people who look like me or act like me, is that I turn against turn against them. Feelings of hopelessness, so not really being afraid to die, but really being afraid to live, and then code switching. So just trying to conform to the status quo and to the standards that have been set for me by the dominant norm as a way to survive. Not necessarily because I want to be white, but because I need to embody whiteness in order to navigate spaces where whiteness has been defined as to what's right and what's professional and what's good. And then when we think about the mental, physical, physiological, and social health implications, is that when people are consistently experiencing this harm, is that this is a re-experience of trauma. It is, people start to avoid, can experience body aches, sleep problems, headaches, intrusive thoughts, numbing, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, which we already talked about, anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, and externalize and internalize those behaviors, which hopefully you all, as you're looking at this slide, really are seeing the connection between what we tend to see as an impact of consistent oppression and really what are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's exactly what this is here. So yeah, I just want to pause for a moment and just ask if there's any additional thoughts or questions or comments before I keep us moving. All right, well, I want to spend some time really talking about okay, great, you've unloaded on us, you've put all this heaviness on us, now what? And, you know, I wish our time together was longer because we could probably spend all day getting into the now what and really thinking about, yeah, as Jenny put, the health effects long-term. Yeah, I typically do cover that in longer presentations, but you're spot on, is there are significant health implications when we think about the impact of constant oppression. It impacts right to the core of one's well-being and body. So this work, when we think about what we need to do, a big part of it is that we need to reduce bias. And a lot of times people think, well, bias is unconscious, so we can't do anything about it. Yes, bias can be, there's implicit and there's explicit bias, and implicit bias is unconscious. But it doesn't mean that we don't know the impact of that bias. We make decisions every single day because of gut reactions or because of pathways that have been carved out in our brain, that sometimes we need to slow down, and slowing down helps us become much more aware of our bias, right? So I'll give you an example of the way that our brain works. So for many of you all, maybe you drop your kids off every day to school or to daycare, or maybe you report into an office every day. And for many of us, we don't even need to think about that, right? I can get in my car, I can bring my kids to school, and I don't even need to think about the directions that I take to get my kids to school because it has become embedded in my brain. That's how bias starts to manifest, is that we have things that we've learned throughout our life that we have just believed, we have just done in our routine, and it has become integrated and embedded into our neurological pathways. But let's say that on one particular occasion, I need to stop somewhere on the way to bringing my kids to school. That requires me to slow down. It requires me to have much more cognitive awareness and be in the moment so that my brain doesn't take over and just go on automatic. And so when you're thinking about, hey, I drive home from work, I know how to get from point A to point B, but today I need to stop and get milk, you slow down and you make a conscious effort to make sure you stop and you get that gallon of milk. So reducing bias requires for us to slow down. It requires for us to think about the way that we think. And when we engage in actions, it requires us to engage in some self-reflection so that we ask ourselves, why did I respond in the way that I responded, and evaluate whether or not perhaps bias showed up. So reducing bias requires us to be aware that bias exists, and requires us to slow down. And some of you are like, Crystal, do you know the work that I do every day? I have to make really quick decisions, and I've got things flying across my desk and phone calls happening. I absolutely know that. I know the stress of working under pressure. But when we have a cognitive load where we have to engage in very quick decision making, is that we are more likely to engage in behaviors or in decisions that are embedded with bias unless we take a moment to reduce that cognitive load and process the information to make better decisions. We also need to take a moment to think about, who are we exposed to on a day-to-day? And are we only exposed to folks that we interact with when we think about diversity, who we provide services to, or in our day-to-day lives? Who are we surrounded by? Who are our doctors? Who do our kids go to school with? Who's in our neighborhood? Who's in our church? And are we perhaps developing some stereotypical beliefs based on who's in our sphere of influence? And might we need to perhaps expand that sphere of influence so that we don't start to develop stereotypes about a certain person or demographic of people looking or behaving in a particular way? Also, you need to be willing to be called out. Sometimes people think that calling out is like, oh, like I'm gonna meet you at the flagpole. That's not what that is. Being called out means that I'm okay with someone letting me know when I've done harm, and that I'm committing to do better. And that I'm committing to call other folks out as well, and to be able to say, hey, I'm not sure if you recognize the impact of your actions, but I'm really curious to know, like, what were your intentions? And let's talk about your intentions a little bit so that we can prevent harmful impact from happening in the future. As you all are engaged in your day-to-day, I would strongly encourage you all to think about how you engage in anti-oppressive practices. An anti-oppressive framework is a method and a process in which we understand that systems of oppression such as colonization, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, results in discriminatory actions and uphold systems of oppression. And when we commit to engaging in anti-oppressive practices, not just as individuals, but as a whole team of service providers, that our goal should be to be able to recognize and dismantle power imbalances in order to mitigate the effects of power imbalances within our communities, and to evaluate our own privilege, challenge what we think we know, and do better to engage the voices of those who are most directly impacted by our work. So what does anti-oppression actually look like in practice? Anti-oppression is both about being preventative, and it's also about providing services in a way where intervention is also anti-oppressive. So it requires us to ensure that all people, especially people who've experienced being underserved or has experienced being pushed to the margins of the margins, are not continuously being re-traumatized, and that our approaches are not about rescuing and saving, that our approaches are built on the values of trust, respect, consent, mutuality, and recognizing the benefit of shared responsibility and interdependence. And so we do this through being trauma-informed, through being culturally responsive, and by being person-centered. Right? So being trauma-informed, I'm sure, is a term that we've had beaten into many of our heads for a really long time. But it's not just about a term, it's about our way of being with people. It's about recognizing that trauma looks different and is differently situated for individuals. So you may have one person that the response to trauma is to kick, to scream, to fight, to cuss us out. And someone else who's experienced trauma that has their arms extended wide open and says, please help me, and I'm so appreciative. And that doesn't mean that one person deserves to be helped over another person. It just means that our trauma responses are different, and therefore our engagement strategies need to be different to meet people where they are. Being culturally responsive is that we recognize the harm that has happened to communities, especially when we think about communities of color, and that we practice cultural humility. Cultural humility is not the same as being culturally competent. Cultural humility is that we recognize that the folks that we're working with are the experts of their lives and their circumstances, and that we build upon the inherent strengths that people bring into space with us. And that then we create the space to understand and to hear their stories. I don't care how many people I've worked with of X, Y, and Z culture who've experienced X, Y, Z type of victimization. I still need to create the space to hear the story of the one person who's sitting in front of me, and to ensure that I am extending the opportunity to take into consideration their culture when I'm designing service plans or connecting them to services. And then being person-centered is that we respect the autonomy of each individual, and that we create space for their voice. And so here's some additional anti-oppressive practices. Do we value and uplift positive relationships, especially as we connect youth with adults? How can we engage in restoration of community norms and around resiliency that is really natural to many communities, right? And I would ask you to consider, a lot of the times we implement evidence-based practices, and evidence-based practices are not evidence-based, based on evidence collected from use with many individuals of color. And then we tend to forget traditional healing practices and bringing in the importance of the land and of music and of food and tradition and of the collective. We need to engage in really deep listening and learning, right? So that we actually genuinely and authentically are engaged in conversation with folks, that we're always working to be collaborative, and that rather than merely seeking to be an ally, I would encourage us to move into what I would consider some co-accomplishment and co-conspiratorship, which means that I'm not just here on the sidelines clapping and cheering you on, but that I'm willing to take a chance and take risk and challenge some of the decisions that are being made, and walk alongside you on this journey, and that we're willing to navigate discomfort. You know, when we started our time together today, I said that this journey is not always comfortable, and it's not designed to be, but it doesn't mean that it's not unsafe. And there are significant differences between being unsafe and being uncomfortable. And we do need to be willing to be uncomfortable. There are many barriers that folks of marginalized and minoritized communities experience when they try to seek help. There's a lot of social stigma. There's a lot of distrust of our systems. We find that when attempting to seek services as individuals of color are more likely to be hospitalized, are more likely to be prescribed antipsychotics, are more likely to experience incarceration versus connection to mental health services, and that many providers are not well versed in what it means to be culturally responsive, even if you are not from the culture that you are working to connect with. Some other pieces as we think about interacting with folks, we talked a lot about microaggressions that occur, but you also need to think about your environment, right? In what ways are the spaces and the services that you provide accessible to all? And rather than thinking about communities as hard to reach or hard to engage, maybe we need to think that the strategies and the way that we're attempting to reach and engage just isn't, it has not been designed to engage and reach those that we're attempting to reach and engage, right? And that changes our lens. It shifts the onus of responsibility so that it's not that it's this person's fault that they've not been engaged, but it really challenges us to think about what haven't we tried and how do we ensure that we're engaging the voices of the communities that we're serving to make sure that they help us in developing our policies, our procedures, our practices, because they're the ones that are most directly impacted. We need to consider language accessibility. Is there translation and interpretation available? Have we thought about people's reading and comprehension level? Most individuals in the United States on average are about a 4th to 6th grade reading level. And so if we've got information that we're distributing that has a whole bunch of nomenclature or has a whole bunch of acronyms or is just written at a very like researchy level, is we're going to miss the ability to connect with people. We need to think about our location, accessibility. We need to think about who are the people who are in our brochures and in our pamphlets and what are the pictures on the wall, and are people represented in not only the distribution of materials and content, but in the provision of services and being able to have the resources that we know will help with the success of folks that come from a certain cultural background or demographics. And then thinking about your forms. And this is something that I'll dig into a little bit more on the equity webinar, but just taking a moment to share, right now to start thinking about what's on your forms. Is inclusive language used? Are the questions intrusive? A lot of times we ask a whole lot of things that a whole lot of people are turned off by because they're afraid they're going to be judged. It could be re-traumatizing to disclose such information on a form, and people don't know what you're using that information for. Anything else come up for y'all as you're just thinking about your environment and thinking about some of the strategies that you can use to engage in anti-oppressive practices? And even questions. We will dig a lot more into like equity frameworks and organizations when we kind of get to that particular workshop, but I just want to give you a little bit of taste in the here and now as we just think about our language and our environments and what we're doing. And so I know we're starting to come to the end of our time together, and I do want to just open it up in the chat for questions. But what I would say to all of you is a lot of the times when we are engaged in this work, there are a lot of things that we realize that there are systems, and there are a lot of systems that do harm. But I would challenge you all to step outside of your places of comfort and recognize that even though the harm may not be impacting you right in this moment, is that there is a lot of harm happening to people of color and to individuals who are Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ right now. And that we realize that we're at a place where we can no longer accept the things that we cannot change, and that we commit to changing some of these things that we can no longer accept, knowing that we truly want to make impact in the lives of children and families and communities, in hopes of what I always say when I do this work is my hope is that I can create such large scale change is that I ultimately put myself out of a job so that people don't need me, and that we ultimately engage in actions that are focused on liberation. So any questions? This is my contact information. I'm just going to kind of look, make sure I didn't miss anything. I love that. Youth won't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. Absolutely spot on. People as a whole, nobody cares how many years of school you went to. Nobody cares about all the letters behind your names. I mean, I respect the letters behind your name. I worked hard for the letters behind mine, but that means nothing when we're thinking about true, genuine, authentic engagement with folks. Oh yeah, absolutely. Indigenous folks are not a race. So I'm glad that you absolutely mentioned that. And unfortunately, there is a lot of controversy right now because of, you know, what we know as an attempt to try to classify Indigenous and Native folks as a race. Thank you. I can send the video, the one with the kids. It's called the Baby Doll Study, and it's done by CNN, but I can make sure that I get that link out. My contact information is here, so if there are certain references or resources that you would like, certainly don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm more than happy to provide that. I know, Cody, you had just some closing announcements. So if there's any other questions, comments, please put them in the chat box, or just send me an email and I'd be more than happy to respond.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was amazing. So we'd greatly appreciate it if everyone filled out this survey. If you want to qualify for the NBCC or NBCC credits, you do need to fill out the survey in order to qualify. You also should send the link, I'm copying the email right now, to this email, or send your name to that email. The presentation recording will be distributed via the OVC-TTA listserv in the coming days. So stay tuned for future webinar announcements. I know we have 2 more planned for you, Crystal, and hopefully more. Those will be announced on the listserv. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your week.